So I just wanted to start with, take me to sort of the moment where you realized you were making a documentary, because it feels like you were kind of gathering material, maybe without even quite knowing it, but there must have been a moment where you, Jacinda, and then you guys as filmmakers had a conversation where you're like, this actually is, we want to make a feature out of this.
Yeah. You know, when you're in a job like, or a role like Prime Minister, obviously your focus is absolutely on doing the incredibly privileged and significant job in front of you. But I was always mindful of capturing a record of that time, and lots of politicians do, usually by note-taking or in long form in some way. I was amongst many politicians who participated in an oral history project. But Clark, my husband, he was a broadcaster by training, so I think it just felt instinctive to him to just pick up his phone and a camera and just start recording moments. The moment of turning that into a documentary, that came once I was out of office. But I think you can see that otherwise I was sometimes a reluctant participant.
Michelle and Lindsay, at what point were you aware of the Turnbull Library recordings and of Clark's penchant for making home movies? Just as a journalist, I watched that and I'm like, oh my God, that is an absolute treasure trove. I wish all my sources did that.
Yeah, right. I think when we first heard those audio diaries, which was after Jacinda left office, you know, as a documentarian, it's your dream to have something that it was never supposed to be released, to all of a sudden be released to you. So hearing it felt incredibly special, but that happened after we had talked about a documentary. It was almost like you'd said you'd recorded them and we were like, I'm sorry, pardon, you have what? So yeah, that was just added to the incredible texture of all the other historic documents that we had. So we had some shooting that happened during the time, obviously Clark's footage. We had no idea that he had been documenting this. And again, so when we first saw that footage, it just, you know, it's incredible.
Yeah. Well, my background, I've worked on a lot of cinema verite films and films with archive. And, you know, before you take on a project, you take a look at some of the material that exists. And most of these films already have material that's been shot, and then you kind of build the film around that. And the moment I saw just a few seconds of Clark's footage, I just instinctually knew that it was a gold mine, and also something that I had just never seen before. That kind of access to a world leader during, you know, those tumultuous years. So it was, you know, really special.
Jacinda, you describe yourself in the film as a reluctant prime minister. And it, you know, we see the kind of taxing nature of the job, specifically in the period that you had the job. What made you want to do something that would put you back in the spotlight? I imagine there must have been some trepidation about it as much as excitement.
I think, you know, I always viewed the role of being Prime Minister as both a privilege but also a responsibility. And I care a lot about public leadership, and I care a lot about putting out into the world that there are alternative leadership styles, like empathetic leadership. And so after I left office and, you know, saw that people started talking a little bit about how empathetic leadership felt unusual to them and they hadn't seen much of it, that I wondered whether or not I could play some small part in just rehumanizing leadership and demonstrating that you can be an empathetic leader and you can also do a job successfully. And so telling this story, showing the behind the scenes, I hope it does that. I hope it humanizes leadership. I hope it also demonstrates a different style of leadership.
I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the specifics. One is that in the aftermath of the Christchurch mosque shooting, you led New Zealand to pass new gun restrictions. In the United States, we have what often seems like an intractable gun control debate and gun violence problem. Based on your experience, would you have any advice for legislators in the US or other countries that have gun violence issues about sort of how to move the ball forward on something that often feels like it's never going to change?
I do get asked this question a little bit, and I'm very mindful that I can only speak to the New Zealand experience because you know, that's my home. I understand, of course, the history and culture and the context of New Zealand in a way that I never will of any other country. But speaking to that experience, all I know is that in the aftermath of March 15, I felt the public expectation for us to act on what had happened and to do everything we could to prevent it from happening again. And so you saw in the film, 120 members of parliament and 119 of them voted in favour for change. And I think that was a reflection of the people we were serving. It was a reflection of where New Zealanders were.
Michelle and Lindsay, I'm curious about sort of your process of putting together the narrative arc. Because on the one hand, because you're beginning after Jacinda's term in office has ended, you have a sort of natural beginning and end to the story. On the other hand, you have to be open to moments that you discover in all of this rich source material that you have. How did you talk through with each other and with Jacinda about how to sort of plot through, okay, we have certain events that we need to cover, but we want to have space for these kind of unexpected, more personal or intimate moments?
Yeah, well, the great thing about Jacinda is that she let us work. She let us do our work. She didn't see a cut until after we submitted to Sundance, and that is truly the best thing when you have a subject that's willing to trust that you're going to craft their story in a way that's honest to their experience. In terms of the process, you know, with documentaries, you're figuring out the movie as you're putting it together. You have no script. So in this case, we had like giant assemblies. You know, our first cut was 17 hours long. But you have to kind of put it together and see what's there and see what's popping out and resonating, see what's missing. You know, a lot of what we had to gather through archive helped contextualize the events that she was going through. So we have this incredibly intimate, you know, these moments with her at home, but you need to kind of understand the world outside. So we had to craft that as well around so that it could, you know, reach an audience outside of New Zealand. So that was just a long process where we looked at long cuts, we talked about what was working and what wasn't.
And what themes really stood out to us as critical for us to cover, and one of those was motherhood and the struggle that many of us have between trying to manage a career or a big job and also being there for our family. And I hadn't seen, and I don't know that we maybe will again for a long time, a world leader open up her own personal account of that in such a raw and vulnerable way so that we could relate as an audience. So that was, we knew where there were themes that felt very important and very novel. And we kept coming back to those, the ones that made us feel something.
Yeah, we never wanted to get too lost in the inside baseball of the politics because it was really a personal journey, a family's journey, and that was a guiding principle, I think, as we put it together.
I was struck, Jacinda, when you resigned, you described it as having outstayed your welcome, or you sort of feared that you had outstayed your welcome. I'm wondering if you think that there is still a possibility of a longer serving democratic leader, someone like Richard Seddon in the New Zealand context, or FDR or Margaret Thatcher, in an era of the kind of level of scrutiny that you get from social media that we see during the Parliament protests?
Great question. You know, I think probably just to put the resignation in that wider context, I was thinking about a whole range of issues, and one of them was just anticipating, you know, the progress that had been made and how to retain that. But the primary was ultimately whether I had enough to keep doing the job well. I wouldn't describe it as burnout. I described it as having enough in the tank, and I'd known that after 5 years, you just don't know what's going to come your way. You need to have those reserves, particularly if you do want to lead with curiosity and without being defensive. And so all of that weighed on my mind. But you're right to ask that question. Will we be a society with those longer periods of leadership when there is such an intensity to leadership now? I don't know whether or not it would be fair to call it additional scrutiny, but certainly from the outside it appears that it may be that way. And that comes back again to my hope in being so open about leadership. With that extra scrutiny, I hope is still we don't lose sight of the fact that there are still humans doing these jobs in public life. And maybe we need to just remind ourselves of that, not just for politicians, but people in leadership or who have our decision makers open for scrutiny. I don't know if that means people will last for longer, but I do hope it means that good people still put themselves forward.
That's a good segue into a question that I wanted to ask of all of you, Jacinda, from your own experience, and the filmmakers from being sort of immersed in that experience. At this moment of sort of rejection of parties in power, and the rise of authoritarianism around the globe and right-wing parties, what do you think is the way forward for progressive and empathetic parties and leadership right now that can also be electorally effective? I know it's a big question, sorry.
No, but I think that perhaps we run the risk of assuming that the things that we're seeking from political leaders are different from the things that we seek from one another. And I happen to be in the camp of people that thinks that the values that we value as communities should be the values that we seek out in leadership. And so I've always had a very simple mantra: why should what we teach our children be any different than what we expect from our leaders? And we teach our kids kindness and generosity and bravery and curiosity. So I hope that we don't lose our expectation that we see that in leadership as well, including political leadership.
I think what was so novel when we saw Jacinda lead back in 2017, being in New Zealand, I'd never seen leadership look like that before. When I've thought about even as a director, you reference a type of leadership. And when she came into power, it was so refreshing. And she was so unapologetically herself as a mother, as a person with deep values. It was so enlightening and inspiring. And I hope that this film will show that leadership can be decisive and powerful. It can do great things for policy change, but can also be done rooted in empathy and kindness. So I don't know if that's going to, fix things tomorrow, but we have to have a beacon. And I hope, this film shows that there is a different way that we can lead.
Well, one of my favorite lines from the movie that Jacinda says is that you underestimate what you're capable of until you're doing it. And I think it's a very powerful message, because in the film we explore her imposter syndrome, which is, I think, something a lot of women especially feel, and overcoming the narratives we tell ourselves in our head that we can't do this job, we're not fit for it, somebody else is better for it. But actually, if you step into it and you find yourself doing it, your confidence grows, and you realize you've stepped into a leadership role. And I hope that young men and women that see this film that may not necessarily see themselves as leaders can imagine that they could be.
The film contains a scene at a UN General Assembly meeting in 2018 where you're asked by the press whether you find Donald Trump likable. And you give what I would describe as a very diplomatic answer. Now that you're out of office, would you describe Donald Trump as likable? And would you answer it differently now than you had to when you actually had to sort of meet with him as heads of state?
I wouldn't answer differently. I think that, what I think about now when we discuss these different forms of leadership and what we see in politics, we run the risk of focusing in on individual personalities. And actually we need to ask ourselves what's going on in people's lives and how that's manifesting in democracies around the world. And I don't think we should define leadership by singular individuals. We should define leadership by the values that we'd like to see in our communities and in one another. So I think I feel the same way now as I did then.